Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Double Waved Yellow podcast for the 2021 French Grand Prix. And I'm joined, as usual, by Hodders and Tyson to review the weekend's action. Hodders, start with you first. We had an interesting Grand Prix when we were expecting a bit of a dull one.
Yeah, I mean, the Castaway in the past has had a bit of notoriety almost of being similar to its neighbour, but not quite to as much a scale. But this weekend, au contraire.
Au contraire, indeed. We got an interesting tactical race, not the sort of smash 'em and bash 'em as we often had in Formula One to cause interesting races, but obviously we will discuss that more as we go on. We will discuss the Formula One race in more detail, but first of all, Tyson is going to talk us through all the action from the support races, and this weekend we had the Formula 3 cars on track.
Yeah, we had some real fun, real exciting stuff happen in the Formula 3 support races this week, but before I get into that, I'm going to bring up the IndyCar race in Detroit 2 weeks ago and the incident involving our own McLaren SP's Felix Rosenqvist. Really scary situation. It appeared his throttle got stuck and he accelerated straight into the tyre barrier. Really nasty crash. Genuinely frightening watching it from his onboard. They had to red flag the session for over an hour as they extracted him and made safety repairs to the retaining barrier. Fortunately, he was conscious and communicating with the medical team, discharged from hospital the next day, and we wish him a speedy recovery. Hope to see him back in the car soon. In the meantime, he's being replaced by a familiar name in Kevin Magnussen, which means both former Haas drivers are now driving in the IndyCar series. So, interested to see how they do.
Yeah, that Rosenqvist accident was very huge, and it's one thing that drivers do often mention when you ask them about sort of the worst case scenarios is the likes of having the front wing go under your car or your rear wing coming off or the stuck throttle. It's just one of those things that you just can't control. But the safety standards and the medical standards out in the IndyCar are exceptional, and it is, as you say, good to hear that Felix is relatively okay, and absolutely we all wish him a speedy recovery and a return to IndyCar very soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. But Formula 3 had its thrills and spills at the weekend. Tell us more about them.
Yeah, sure did. So, as always, it follows the format they've established in 2021. Friday qualifying sets the grid for Sunday's feature race. Reverse top 12 of qualifying sets the grid for sprint race 1. The result of that race reverses the top 12 finishers. That sets the grid for sprint race 2. And honestly, I wasn't expecting much from Le Castellet when the weekend started, but the third sprint race absolutely delivered. It's probably the most exciting Formula 3 race I've seen since I've started following the series. All through the race, top 5 positions, constantly changing. I think 5 different drivers had the lead at one point. There were drivers moving through from the reverse qualifying positions to put themselves in podium contention, and then just a great fight in the final laps between Alex Smolia and Victor Martin, which ended up in a last lap overtake by Smolia to take the win after starting in 6th. Just fantastic race, highly recommended. Speaking of Martin, the Frenchman had a great weekend at his home GP. Started 10th in the first sprint race, sived his way through the field. As I mentioned, took the lead at one point, almost took the win, but had to settle for second. Followed that up with another podium in sprint race 2 from starting 11th on the grid, and finished third after a great overtake on the second to last lap, which spoiled Prama's ambitions of a triple podium. And then he capped off his weekend with a very respectable 4th place in the feature race. Scored himself some very nice points, put him well up in championship contention. Speaking of the championship, another driver who had a good weekend was the man going into it as the leader, Red Bull Academy's Dennis Hauger. Fairly uneventful sprint race 1, but then he turned it up in the next 2. Double podium in sprint 2 in the feature. Got himself a nice haul of points, retained his lead at the top of the championship. Arthur Leclerc, it looked like he was going to have a bad weekend after breaking his suspension in qualifying, starting at the back of the grid in sprint 1, P30, but He really salvaged his weekend, showed off his overtaking credentials, managed to pull himself all the way up to P12, which set him up for pole position on sprint race 2, and then just a beautifully controlled race, led the entire way, converted the pole to a win, got himself 15 points. Really needed those to save the weekend. Unfortunately, he didn't score anything in the feature, but repeated his performance from sprint race 1, pulling himself all the way up to P13. And speaking of the feature race, we had rain, which spiced things up quite nicely. The track dried out fairly quickly, and we got to see some interesting gambles down the field. People going onto slicks. By the end of the race, they were setting some blistering times. But in the end, it was Jack Doolan who mastered the wet conditions. He took the time to line up Dennis Hauger and then just picked the perfect opportunity to overtake him and took the win. Banked some nice points as well in the sprint races, and he's well in championship contention now. So those were the main takeaways, but other things worth mentioning. Clement Novalak, he didn't particularly stand out, not on the pace with the leaders, but solid, consistent weekend. P5, P6 in the sprints, P5 in the feature. Gives him some nice points, keeps him in the championship. Ollie Caldwell, poor weekend, it has to be said. Came into the weekend 2 points off the championship lead, but only managed to 10th and the 4th in the sprints. And then contact in the opening laps of the feature race. DNF really sealed his weekend. And once again, great to see Juan Manuel Correa in the pod scoring positions. He's recovering well from the incident in Spa 2 years ago. Overall, good clean racing all round throughout the weekend. Relatively few incidents to speak of. Which leads us to the championship standings. Dennis Hauger's double podium keeps him at the top with 66 points. Victor Martin, consistent weekend, scored well, catapults him up to second with 60 points. And the feature race win for Jack Doohan puts him in third with 58 points. Close fight at the top. Too early to call it. Still 5 rounds, 15 races to go, but certainly don't write off drivers like Clement Novalak, Ollie Caldwell, or Alex Mollier. Any one of them could have a good weekend, put them right back up there in contention. And that was the French Formula 3 support race. For round 3, we're heading to the Red Bull Ring in Austria, and I think we're going to see some great races there.
Okay, thanks for that review, Tyson. And as you alluded to, round 3 will be at Spielberg, and that is in a couple of weeks' time to support the Austrian Grand Prix Formula 1 weekend. Let's move on now to the Formula 1 French Grand Prix and the main headlines. Max Verstappen wins after a late pass on Lewis Hamilton, with Perez finishing third. A Mercedes strategy failure has potentially cost the team a 1-2 finish. McLaren's had a strong weekend, finishing 5th and 6th, whereas both Ferraris finishing outside the points. So let's take a look at the drivers we were focusing on. And first of all, one of the drivers I was keeping an eye on was the race winner, Max Verstappen. And what a superb race he had. Started from pole for the 5th time in his career. Passed Hamilton in the first round of stops via the undercut. Then boldly decided to be one of only 2 drivers to take a second stop, switching from the hards back to the mediums, pitting on lap 33, resulting in being behind Hamilton by about 18 seconds. And then he just stormed back up. At several points, he was 2 seconds a lap faster than Lewis Hamilton, passing him with a lap and a half to go, securing him the win. The Driver of the Day award from the fans, the fastest lap point, and all of this whilst suffering radio issues throughout. Hodders, a superb race again from Max.
It was a superb race for Max, and then also a superb race for Red Bull. That 2-stop strategy, which hardly any of the drivers implemented other than maybe Leclerc, it paid off handsomely, it was smart, and it definitely provoked some ire when other drivers were frustrated not going for it themselves, or their team's not going for it. An absolutely belting Sunday for Max Verstappen.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tyson will come into it in a bit more detail, but it appears that Red Bull have once again outfoxed Mercedes on the strategy.
Yeah, they got the strategy absolutely perfect. And Verstappen, he seems to be making a habit of this. He has a bit of a bad start, and then he just recovers it.
Yeah, it's good stuff. Great to see. Hodders, you were keeping an eye on a couple of the midfield drivers this weekend. First and foremost, tell us about Carlos Sainz.
Well, Carlos Sainz, he had a pretty good start to the race weekend. Had a good showing in practice. In fact, he was third fastest of the field in free practice 3. He had a very solid qualifying, finishing in 5th overall on the grid. Didn't really have the greatest of races. I mean, Ferrari didn't as a whole, to be fair. And unfortunately finished just outside the points in P11.
Yeah, not a promising result there. Well, what looked like being a promising result and a great haul of points, especially off the back of the Baku race. Not a great result there. Tyson, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Ferrari, they just seemed invisible to me this week. I didn't really notice them, to be honest.
It's one of those performances which they'd rather not be visible on. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Moving back to one of my drivers, and I was keeping an eye on both of the French drivers. So we'll start with Pierre Gasly, qualifying P6 for the 5th time this year, finishing P7. It's again, he's always finished in the top 10 this year. He was in the top 10 all throughout practice, and he did only lose that one position to Danny Ricciardo via the undercut, which we'll hear a bit more about later on. Hodders, Gasly's just having a nice, solid season, which is what he wants at AlphaTauri.
He really is. The Frenchman is really making an impression in that AlphaTauri side. I mean, to be, again, consistently top 10 once again, as he has in the last few race weekends, shows he's really establishing himself as one to keep an eye on.
And Tyson, Gasly obviously made it very clear that he doesn't want to go back to the Red Bull main team, but if he continues with these consistent performances, could we see Gasly going elsewhere?
It's possible, but for now, I think he's happy at AlphaTauri. He just seems to have the car where he wants it, and he's scoring consistent points.
Which is what a team like AlphaTauri needs, which is very important. Hodders, your second driver that you were keeping an eye on, not Darren, but it was Daniel Ricciardo.
Yes, I'm not going to make the same faux pas as the race engineers, which was quite funny, actually. Daniel Ricciardo had a great weekend. He qualified P10, which isn't ideal, but it was a very competitive middle pack on the Saturday. It was also the position he wound up in free practice 3. He very cleverly used the undercut, courtesy of his team's instructions on the pit, to overtake Gasly, and it did pay off when Gasly did go into pit. And in the end, had a very good weekend and finished in P6.
Yeah, an excellent weekend for the Australian. And he's really starting to feel at home at the McLaren side. Tyson, a great haul of points, not just for Danny Rick, but for McLaren as a whole over the weekend there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I did question the strategy with Lando Norris leaving him out, but it turned out to be the right decision. And, yeah, nice haul of points for both of them.
Absolutely. And back to Gasly's fellow compatriot Esteban Ocon, qualified P11, just missing out on qualifying 3 by just over 1/10 of a second. Finished P14, but was 8th throughout the practice. So, again, Hodders, a driver who had showed so much promise throughout practice, throughout qualifying, but in the race, when the points are paid out, it's all faded away.
It's a real shame. I mean, Ocon has either had bad luck in previous weekends or he's just not performed on the Sunday. And if he wants to really establish himself, he needs to make sure that he's consistent on all 3 days. It's all well and good doing reasonably well in the middle of the pack when it comes to practice and qualifying, but it's Sunday that matters.
And Tyson, with such a compact midfield, for teams like Alpine, every point is going to count.
Yeah, absolutely. Ocon has a good weekend here and there. I think he just needs to be a little more consistent. But as you said, the mid-pack, very tightly packed. It's difficult to get into those point positions sometimes.
We'll say, well, hopefully we'll see Ocon be a bit more reliable and consistent in the top 10. But wait and see. And finally, Hodders, we're having a look at the back of the grid, and we're taking a look at Mick Schumacher,
who could have been higher up were it not for misfortune. It was the first time, actually, that he would have raced in Q2. He finished 14th in the end. Unfortunately, as it turned out, he managed to crash about 30 seconds from the end of the first qualifying session, bringing the session to a premature end, which also affected other drivers adversely. It is worth noting, though, that in Q1 he finished 14th, and in so doing finished ahead of the two Williams drivers, who, it should be pointed out, finished only 0.02 apart in 15th and 16th. When it came to the race itself, unfortunately, the Haas car's slight inadequacies came to the fore, and he finished in the end in 19th position. But promise is there.
Yeah, the promise is there, and it's showing that Schumacher, in terms of the actual raw pace, is closing up to the two Williams drivers. But Tyson, it's looking like there's going to be a season-long battle to avoid finishing in last place between Williams and Haas. Which are we going to? Who would you say is the more likely to avoid that dishonourable title?
I would probably say Williams, because Haas have let it be known that they're not going to work anymore on this year's car. They're looking for 2022 at this point. So for the Haas drivers, I think it's just a learning season at this point.
Okay, and that's not too bad. And just some other bits and pieces across the weekend. So Yuki Tsunoda got a penalty, a pit lane start, after he crashed his car during qualifying. He needed to change the floor. So pit lane start, nothing too untowards there. We had no yellow flags throughout the race. All the drivers well behaved. No one was spinning off on the vast infields at Paul Ricard. And for the first time since the 2019 Austrian Grand Prix, we had all 20 cars finish. So Hoddard's showing that not only are the cars very, very reliable in the current era, but also the drivers are just making sure that they get to the finish, because you never know what's going to happen.
You really don't know what's going to happen, as has been proven in the past. The fact that everyone managed to stay primarily on the track, there were a couple of slight veer-offs and everything else, but I suppose there's the leeway at Le Castellet that if you do make a mistake, you can recover with the escape roads. But it is pleasant to see all 20 cars actually finishing, and no one being lapped more than once either.
Absolutely. And the race order staying the same as well, no post-race penalties, which was good. We'll move on now to our winners and spinners. We're going to discuss who had a race to remember and who had a weekend they'd rather forget. Hoddard, will come to you first. Who had their best race had the best race for this weekend?
For me, I have to stick with the man with the famous grin from down under. It has to be Daniel Ricciardo. I was actually reading in the papers before the race that he was very optimistic going into the weekend, and he feels like he's adapting well to the new McLaren car. In fact, I remember seeing in one of the English newspapers on Monday morning that he was talking about he's liking the fact he's got French circuit followed by Austria twice, because it means he's got some less hectic circuits where he can, I think he said, it can accelerate his learning on the car. He does seem to be getting comfortable with that McLaren car, as shown by his results. A vastly improved race weekend after the last few weeks, and hopefully it can continue.
Yeah, fingers crossed. And as I said, it does appear that Daniel is settling into the McLaren team and settling alongside his teammate Lando Norris. Tyson, we could see, I think we're probably going to see over the next couple of weeks the battle between Danny Rick and Lando closing up and intensifying, which can only be a good thing for the sport, providing they don't crash.
Yep, the number one rule, don't hit your teammate, but I am looking forward to seeing them fight out on the track.
Oh, absolutely. It should be great stuff to see. For me, my winner, it could only be one driver, and that is Max Verstappen, executing his two-stop strategy flawlessly, making the undercut work after the first round stop. I think he was something like 0.6 of a second faster on his outlap compared with Lewis. And then this final stint on the medium tyres working, just putting Lewis and Mercedes in an absolute checkmate position to the point where if Lewis had pitted, he wouldn't have been able to execute the undercut. And base, it's just a case of, well, you're going to get past one way or the other. So a great work from Max and the Red Bull team. In fact, Max's only mistake was actually letting Hamilton pass into turn one at the start when Verstappen sort of outbraked himself. Whether the result and the strategy of the race would have been different, we will never know. Hodders, just great work from Max and Red Bull.
It was very much a team effort, and Max once again was smart. The team was smart. That two-stop strategy worked incredibly well, and I think, as you'll allude to later on, that other teams wish they'd done the same. The undercut was perfect, and the fact that only two drivers went for the two-stop shows it was a pretty clever idea under the circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And Tyson, we've used to seeing in previous years Mercedes being very strong tactically. What has happened this year?
I have no idea what's happened to them. I'm remembering a few years ago when they were fighting Ferrari, they would instigate the strategies. Ferrari would react. It seems now it's almost a complete 180. Red Bull are instigating the strategies. Mercedes are left reacting to them, and they're getting left behind.
Absolutely, we'll allude to a bit more in a bit. Meanwhile, at the more towards the tail end, Hodders, who had a race to forget.
Well, if you thought Carlos Sainz had a lousy weekend with Ferrari, I think Charles Leclerc's weekend was much, much worse. He qualified in 5th place, and then to finish down in the lower third is incredibly disappointing. And the one thing that he was hindered by as well, it seems to, was tyre wear. Both Ferraris were saying that when it came in during qualifying, they were really, really struggling to get those front tyres up to temp, and hopefully it doesn't blight them into future weekends.
Yeah, so we saw a number of drivers affected over the French Grand Prix weekend with tyre wear. It seems it's very important to not only get these tyres up to full race temperature, but keep them there.
Yeah, and again, I think it comes down to the strategy a lot of teams chose. They realised the wall stuff was not going to work.
Yeah, but not many decided to act upon it. And coming back, and we are giving them a bit of a hammering this weekend when we used to sing their praises. For me, my spinner of the weekend, it has to be the Mercedes team, and in particular the Mercedes strategy. It was awful, especially, it's become apparent after the race that both Hamilton and Bottas were suggesting even before the start of the race that they should be looking at two-stop strategies. Hodders, we obviously had a look at the notes issued by Pirelli suggesting what the ideal strategies would be. Two-stop strategy was never on that list.
It absolutely wasn't, and it could also say that the two-stop strategy was almost unorthodox more than anything else. Though, to be honest, I think it was also a case of when things don't quite go as planned, particularly when tyres aren't quite getting the longevity you expect, sometimes you do have to go unorthodox, and for some it worked. In fact, I remember Bottas actually saying a few laps from the end, I think he was saying, I bleeping told you it was going to be a two-stop race, and Mercedes admitted they were wrong.
Mm-hmm. And Tyson, Hodders was alluding to unorthodox strategies and unorthodox pit stops. Sometimes we've often seen throughout the past, unorthodox strategies just work perfectly.
Yeah, there was a lot of interesting strategies going on throughout the field. I think Mercedes strategy team, though, they definitely got it wrong. Just the two radio messages are the big takeaway. Lewis Hamilton, let's make sure we undercut them this time. They didn't do it. Valtteri Bottas, why did no one listen to me about the two-stopper? That really says everything.
Mm-hmm. And actually, Holders, just thinking about, there's one person we have not really spoken about in regards to the tyre strategy, and that's Sergio Perez, because Red Bull left him out on a very, very long first stint, but as a result, he was obviously able to support his teammate in getting back up through the field, and also passing Bottas towards the end as well. I'm just checking the notes here that I have brought up. So yeah, Perez pitted on lap 24 to go onto the hards and then going all the way to the end. So I think him and Norris were the last two drivers to make their first stop.
Yeah, there were drivers, I think, that were really taking what could definitely be classed with the conditions as a gamble, although at the same time, yes, they left Checo out for a very long time for Red Bull, but it did seem to pay off.
Absolutely. Right, so let's move on now to our talking points. And because we didn't really have any major incidents over the weekend, we are going straight into Lewis versus Max round 7. And quite clearly, the winner of this round was Max with a superb strategic implementation from Red Bull. Tyson, what were your thoughts of this championship battle?
It's getting really interesting now. Lewis, I've mentioned it before, he has some legitimate competition for this championship now. And I think that's only going to bring out the best in him in future races.
Absolutely. And Hodders, are we now potentially looking at the point where this is getting more and more Max's championship to lose?
I wouldn't disagree with that statement, considering that he's already 12 points ahead of a 7-time world champion, and we've only had, 7 races in a 23-race season. It's still too early to make a full-on judgment, but I think in the next few races, if these sorts of results continue, then we could see a gap starting to form that may not be reduced by Lewis Hamilton. So I think the pressure's on for Lewis to try and get back to his former form.
Well, we will wait and see. We've obviously got a few big races coming up. We have got the 2 races in Austria over the next couple of weekends. And we've then got a little event called the British Grand Prix as well. So important races for both drivers and teams in the championships. And speaking of the championship, the current standings, Max Verstappen increases his lead to 12 points at the top of the driver standings on 131 points. Lewis Hamilton second on 119. Sergio Perez position 3 on 84. Lando Norris on 76. And Valtteri Bottas on 59. In the Constructors' Championship, Red Bull now tearing away at the top. They've now got a 37-point cushion over Mercedes. 215 plays, 178, nearly a full race gap between the two. McLaren continue to solidify their third place position on 110. Ferrari, after a woeful weekend, slipped back 94 points in fourth. AlphaTauri on 45, Aston Martin 40, Alpine on 29. Alfa Romeo in 8th with those 2 critical championship points. Williams and Haas still to get off the mark. Moving forward to our final thoughts. For me, we were obviously discussing pre-race that we thought French Grand Prix is going to be a dull, boring, uninteresting race because of the nature of the track, because we never really get any proper racing there. But Hodders, it was an interesting race this year because of how the strategy developed over the second half of the race.
It absolutely did. I mean, you don't have to have plenty of full-on, overtakes and crashes to make an exciting race. The fact is that the tactical game made an interesting and exciting race. And we hopefully we'll see more of those in the future. The tyre strategies in recent races have really been paying off and made it interesting.
Absolutely. And Tyson, we're seeing that strategy is becoming a critical element in the championship battle. And I think like most bits, it's going to be a case that whoever wins this championship battle, whether it's driver or team, they have to get the strategy right.
I think that's the key point. It's going to come down to the strategy, whoever wins that battle.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've had a look back at the French Grand Prix. Now let's look forward to what's coming up. So this weekend we have the first of two races at the Red Bull Ring. It's the Styrian Grand Prix, and we're starting to get more fans back in. We're expecting to see around about 15,000 people at the circuit on race day, which would be great. Looking at the forecast, we've got a likely chance of rain for either qualifying or the race, and possibly support races. Hodders, this is a really fast, exciting track, isn't it?
It really is. It's one of those tracks where anything can and will happen. I mean, it's one of the shortest tracks on the calendar. Only 10 turns and lap times around 1.5 to 1.10. It's going to be fast and it's going to be furious.
And because it's fast and furious, Tyson, highly likely that we may see the safety car intervene.
It's very possible. They kicked off the season last year with Austria doubleheader, and it was a really good start to the season, so I'm looking forward to this.
Mm-hmm. And as we mentioned, it is Red Bull's home race, so there will probably be a sea of orange Max Verstappen fans, and there'll probably be a few cans or two of Red Bull littering the grandstands. Hopefully not literally. We want everyone to tidy up, etc. But yeah, a lot of chance I will see a fair few of that. Hodders, comes to you. Any final thoughts from France and going into this weekend?
Well, France has once again proven us wrong, as many races have on regular occasions. Hopefully, we're proven right for a change in the next couple of weekends. One thing I am looking forward to when we go to Austria for the next couple of weekends is we have the next of our support series coming up, namely the W Series.
Yes, and we will, of course, as we always do with the Formula 2 and the Formula 3 series, we will bring you all the news from the W Series as well. And lastly, Tyson, we're going to be seeing more spectators coming in. So obviously we've got 15,000 for this weekend. But for next weekend, for the Austrian Grand Prix, we've got 60,000 in. And today it's been announced that the British Grand Prix at Silverstone will have a full capacity crowd on race day of 140,000. Spectators are coming back to sport. It's great to see.
Yeah, absolutely great to see. I mean, right at the end of the French race, we had Max Verstappen passing Lewis Hamilton and just the roar of the crowd. It's something, you miss it when it's not there.
Absolutely, and hopefully we will see and hear more of it as the championship season goes on. Well, that's all for the podcast today. My thanks to Hodders and Tyson for their contribution. My thanks to you for listening in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. All very important stuff. We will talk to you next week after the Styrian Grand Prix and obviously building up to the Austrian Grand Prix. Be good, and if you can't be good, be safe. From all of us here, bye-bye.